Welcome to Design Signatures, a podcast by Fedrigoni, Masters of Paper and Creativity since 1888. Design Signatures is a series of conversations all about design, creativity, special paper, and beyond. I'm Ambra Fridegotto, Head of Marketing at Fedrigoni UK. On each episode, I'm joined by our long-term collaborators, Johnny Sevdos and Danny McNeil, co-founders of Design Studio TM.
In this series, we're joined by international designers
who are shaping the world of publishing.
We'll dive into their stories, how they got started, their thoughts on where the industry is now, and where they see it heading in the future.
Today we're joined by Fanette Mellier, graphic designer and artist from Paris, France.
Hi Fanette, thank you so much for joining us today. Your work occupies a space somewhere between art and design. How would you describe your practice?
I consider myself as a graphic designer and not as an artist, in fact, because I think when I made my art studies, I have chosen to be designer because I had a real interest in the field of applied arts. Mm-hmm. And I like to work with constraints, with commissions, and it's my daily practice to work with a lot of elements that are graphic design elements. And I think it's not the same thing to be an artist, but I think it's a sort of a paradox. I think you can be an artist in your field. Like you can be an artist of architecture, you can be an artist of cooking, an artist of cinema, an artist of bakery. And I hope I could be considered as an artist of graphic design because I like to experiment. But for me, my experimentation is related to designer's tool. For example, I like to experiment on type design. I like to experiment with reading and with books, with color, with paper. And I think this experimental dimension can sometimes be considered like an artistic position. But in fact, my reality is to be a designer, and I've chosen my profession for these applied aspects.
Right. Can you tell us about where it all started for you in terms of where you're from in France, where you studied, how you kind of first discovered the world of graphic design?
I discovered the graphic design when I was very young because my family worked in a publishing field. Right. So when I was a child, my father, my mother works with a question of graphic design, of impression. And for me, it was a very familiar field. I didn't have a conscience that I was going in the same way than my parents.
And how did your career start? What companies did you work at?
When I was a student, I had a professor, Pierre Di Giulio, that is very well known in France as a type designer, but also as an artist, unlike a graphic designer. And when he was my professor, he asked me to come to work in his studio at the end of my studies. For me, to go in Paris was a way to have more interesting commissions, to meet some other designers, and it was very, very important to me to go in Paris. Pierre Di Giulio asked me to be a sort of intern. It was between an internship and a first job. And I worked during 9 months in a studio. And he proposed me to work in different works. For example, I worked on an exhibition project about Chinese medicine at La Villette. and I worked on designing types, and I worked on very various projects, and it was very interesting. And I think I was very young, and I was very lucky to have a possibility to learn so many things in a few months.
Was it just you and him then? It was just the two of you in the office?
We were just the two, because he works alone, and so it was very interesting because every day we eat together. We had some discussions. I was very close. There was a lot of joy in his way of working on design. So I think it was really a chance to be so close during a few months.
Yeah, that must have been a big influence for you, or maybe you're just the same kind of person because you see your work has got a lot of joy in it. I think that's one of the biggest things. It's so joyful. I think, especially in the use of color and the playfulness.
It gave me the conscience that you can practice graphic design in your own way, and it's not an obligation to be in a classical studio with other designers, etc. It's a possibility, but you can also have a sort of path that is not that is very independent. If your work is special, you will have very special commissions, and it can be very distinctive, in fact.
Did you ever work in studios with more people, or did you start independent? You did?
After these 9 months with Pierre Dichouliot, I started to work in the studio of Pierre Bernard. That is, he was a very well-known graphic designer in France. It's a sort of legend of graphic design. So he had his own studios with 4 or 5 young designers that were between 20 and 30. And they started to work with him. And I worked during 2 years in his studio, and it was very interesting because there was a political dimension on his work, a social dimension, and he was very passionate by his practice. And also I had the chance to be with other designers, other young, very talented designers.
Yeah.
But it was more classical than Pierre Dichouliot because it was a very classical way of making design. It was not really commercial. It was designed for public institutions, but it was not experimental. It was a very high-level design, but it was a classical way to practice graphic design.
Do you feel like you already had a style at that point, like from when you started your studies, or do you think this was an integral part in developing that style?
I think I had my own expressions. For example, I was very obsessed by the question of printing, even when I was a student. But I think it's related with the fact that my father was a printer, and I could make some experimentation with his machine. So it was I was very interested by the question of process, diffusion, experimentation, and plasticity.
I'm sure it also helped you when you had to come up with ideas with clients. You maybe almost already knew some of the things that were possible, and your ideas could be more varied because you'd experimented thanks to your dad's job.
Yeah, I think I had the conscience of in France we say chaîne graphique. It's all the process from conception to printing. And I think I had the conscience, the ideas can be transformed, etc. And I think as a child, I could observe. It's like, it's as if I was a very old designer. when I was 25 years.
Your knowledge of printing has kind of informed the way that you work in terms of color as well. So I know there's a number of projects you've done where you've like color is such an integral part of the project. Papillon being one of those that sort of really strikes us, I think, in terms of how you use color, how you embrace color with that project. And it's a project for a printer as well, I think. Could you talk us a bit about that project and exactly what your approach was?
I think color is a very important aspect in my work. As a designer, I think in color before form.
Yeah.
So there are several ways to use colors, and color is a tool, and it depends a lot the kind of project. For example, the papillon is another way to experiment color. For me, I wanted to make some books that every copy is different, and every copy has singular results in the use of color. So I make experimentation during printing. So it was another process.
Is it a screen printed project?
It was a mix between offset, seal screen, and foil. So there was 3 ways of printing, and if you change the order of pages, it will make a new butterfly. But for the offset and the seal screen, there was mixes of colors during the printing. So it made some gradients, or there was some drops of color in seal screen, etc.
Originally, was it a poster series for a screen printer, or have I imagined that?
There was it was not the same printers, because there was a seal screen printer that is called Lézard Graphique, and we made I think 3 papillons with them, and we mixed. It depends, but we mixed a lot of inks. And there was another printer that was Arrêt Caractère. It was in the southwest in France. It's a diagonal between the two.
Yeah.
And they made different kind of works. And after it was all together to make the books.
And how does your choice of material, influence your production method, or at what point do you start considering materials in the books you're producing?
Yeah, the choice of materials is very important in editorial design. It's a tool to express different kind of. It's like a language, in fact, to choose the materials. So the paper is very important for me, and I think my favorite material is color paper because it's an augmentation of possibilities to play with color. Because as a designer, you have a color range of Pantone, for example, and it's inside your computer, and it's very fluid to produce with this color range. Mm-hmm. But the different possibilities that you have with a paper collection, it creates new way to interact with color and to create multiply the possibilities with color. And I like to have surprise. So for example, when you print on color paper, you can have a lot of different kind of effects. I like to print in offset with color paper because it depends on the inks, but in general, the inks are transparent. But if you have metal inks, you can have some effects. It changes the spectrum of color, and I think this element is very, very interesting. For example, in Panorama, I choose a blue paper that is a Fedrigoni paper, Imitlin. And I like because it's a fiandra, it's a toile.
Yeah.
There is a material effect that is very interesting.
There
are asperities. So I like this color because it's not only a color, it's a material. It's very fundamental. And I have chosen this material before to choose the colors for inside for printing inside the book.
Yeah, so inside was white stock that you printed colors to replicate similar to get near to that blue and work away from it to go darker into the night. Yeah.
In lots of my books, my personal books, inside the books, it's white paper.
Yeah.
But they are all printed. There is no more blank space inside the books. For example, Panorama, Dans la Lune, Matryoshka, you can't see the white of the initial paper.
Yeah.
So I think I like this and I choose this because when you don't have the white color of the paper becomes a material, a pure material, and you can feel some aspects like touch, roughness that are very interesting because you have a relationship with paper that is very physical.
You must also have a close relationship with white paper and the differences between white papers, because some white papers are more blue, some are more yellow, and I guess if you're printing color on it, it must interact with that.
Yeah, it depends on for example, for the book for the Ninfea in Orsay, I choose a white paper that is quite cold white because I think it could be more interesting for the printing of a picture, of a painting, because it's more close to the reality. And but in general, I prefer warm paper. It depends, but if there are text on a paper, on a white paper, I prefer that it's a little bit warm. So it depends, but in fact, each time you have a project, the more important is to be coherent with the subject, with the kind of project, and each time is different problematic.
Like you said before, I feel like the texture also plays such a massive part, because with Imitlin, for example, you chose the fiandra, and I find that sometimes the same shade but in the different embossings can somehow alter the color a little bit. And the same is with the inside, the white pages. If you use a more rough paper like Materica, for example, the color can look quite different than if you use a smoother paper like Arena. So does that play? How do you kind of choose what texture paper to have for your inside pages?
For me, it's not only texture, it's weight, weight of a book, for example.
Bulkiness, yeah.
If it's heavy, it's not the same that if it's very light. So it depends on the project. But when you make some editorial design, it's like a recipe, and it's not only an ingredient, but it's all the ingredients. Are they function all together or not? It's a balance between different ingredients. So I think if you have one special texture, you choose it just for one paper in the book, and it's a very important choice, because it will have interaction with all the chosen paper. But also, if you, for example, for the Ninfea, we have chosen it to reproduce the aspect of painting. And it gives materiality of reproduction that is very interesting, because it's like just a piece of reproduction in scale 1, and if as if you had a little piece of Nymphaea just to wrap the book. So it depends. But
when you're considering a book and a format, do you let technical constraints also guide that process sometimes in terms of picking a binding style? How do you make a decision around how you're going to bind a book or how you're going to work with a certain format?
About binding, I think I'm not very good.
Okay. Stop there then.
But in binding, it's not easy for me to choose a binding because I'm not very, very good. So I try to be okay with this, but it's often quite classical. But I think about the project for Hermes for the activity report. It's a binding, so it's very visual. And I at least this one is quite sophisticated binding. But I think it was interesting to choose that because binding is used in office. It can be sophisticated, but it can be unsophisticated. And for an activity report, that is an internal communication document, I thought it was interesting to choose this kind of binding that is very visual, but that is very familiar to simple documents on Office. And I choose this in blue. They made a blue bangle that was very close to this material and this color. So I to make a little link between this bangle that is in photo inside the activity reports.
On the topic of constraints, you mentioned at the very beginning that you like working with constraints. So if you have a brief from a project from a client, obviously they maybe tell you what they want. But when you're working on your own personal project, how do you set those constraints for yourself?
I like the constraints because in general, it's a sort of game for me, like an engineer, for example, you have a certain kind of constraints, technical, economical, and in terms of subject too. And you have to make a mix and to find solutions. So it's a kind of invention, in fact, like an engineer. So I like because for me, it's a sort of mental, intellectual exercise to have all these aspects, intellectual aspects, social aspects, and also technical, practical aspects. And I think the practice of designer is very complete because intellectually, I think it's very, very interesting. And every subject is different for different kind of commissions, and it allows me to have to meet different kind of people, to know different kind of subjects, and I think it's the more important in my work. But in my personal project, I think I have some because I'm not alone, because I am in a conversation with publisher like Édition du Livre or other publishers. It depends. Or sometimes when I make an exhibition, it can be I can be in conversation with a curator or a instructor. It depends. So I'm not alone when I make my all my projects, but each time the constraints are not the same because I have my own constraints, but I try to be strong, to be in my own path and to experiment a question in particular. So each book, for example, has its own constraints. On Matryoshka, I had the ideas to explore a little tiny book, very little format. And it was before to choose to make the Matryoshka, I had this idea. You has a sort of, I don't know when you loop in French.
We call it a loop here as well.
I wanted to have this very little book, because it was about the question of to be precious or not, on this apprehension of a very, very delicate, very small, very fragile elements. And for me, it was another apprehension of the book. And after I have this idea, and after I develop everything around this, and after it's coherent. For example, with Panorama, I didn't want to make a drawing of my chalet. It's a pretext. I wanted to explore the power of color as a narrative tool. And for me, it was an experimentation. And I choose to make this landscape and to make this drawing, even if it's related, it's allegoric in a way. But for me, the technical aspect of the book, the technical apprehension was before the question of a wood house.
Yeah.
And speaking about the narrative of color, when you are coming up with a color palette, when do you know that you're ready? When do you know that it's done? Do you ever change after a while? You start working with a color palette and then think, actually, this red is wrong, I'll change it, or you're quite set from the beginning with what your parameters are?
It depends on the project, but in fact, sometimes I make a sort of palette with Pantone sheets, and I put little Pantone sheets and
in real life,
in
not
real
on the
life.
screen.
And after I cut, for example, Fedrigoni color, Fedrigoni samples.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a lot of holes inside my. It's not an example, but I take a very little sheet of paper and I put it with color
chips,
sheets of Pantones.
Mm-hmm.
I have to see it all together. I think I can have a global vision of the colors. But for example, in the Moon book, you don't have all the 9 colors together.
Mm-hmm.
It's an
right.
idea. It's a color palette that I have in the conception, but the fact it doesn't really exist. It's an idea.
Could you just rewind a bit back to, I guess, your earlier days when you had a residency, artistic residency at Chaumont, at the Design Museum there? And I know that you produced some, I guess, self-initiated books as part of that residency. So it'd be really interesting to hear more about that.
Yeah, this residency was made when I was I started my career, so it was 20 years ago, I think.
Yeah.
I had the chance to have this proposition because as a young designer, I didn't have a lot of projects to show, but they trust me as a young woman designer. And
how were you selected for that? How did the?
It was quite informal because it was a very small world. Now there a lot of designers, but 20 years ago it was a very, very small community. They know the artistic direction. There was Pierre Bernard that I worked with.
Okay.
There was some other designers that I know, and they wanted to propose me to be in residency. And I think I was a woman, and they wanted to change because it was a man before me, and before, and they wanted to be a young woman. I think it was a good thing for them. So I had this change.
And 20 years ago was the really impressive. Is it Lessines, the building and where the poster festival is? Was that there then?
No, it was the building didn't exist. It was just a sort of festival that was every year. Now it's a biennial, but at the time it was every year, and it was in another building, and it was very informal. It was complicated because they wanted to make this center of graphic design, but it was a project. But I think when Le Cygne opened its door, it was a very long process. So when I was in residency, they had some. There was a very perhaps 3 or 4 people that worked for the festival, and it was called Pôle Graphisme, and it was a way to make all year long some projects related to graphic design. But I have this incredible choice to make a project during 2 or 3 years. It was very long residency. Yeah. And I could make a very ambitious project because there was a lot of money to make these books. I think now it could be impossible to.
Yeah.
So
the good old days.
Yeah. So I thought it was interesting to experiment the link between literature and graphic design because there was lots of literature book in England and in the USA. There are graphical covers, but in France it's very austere graphic design for novels. In general, it's collection, and you have Gallimard, Les Éditions de Minuit, and it's the same design since 50, 60 years or more.
So what are you doing at the moment? What's next? What kind of projects are you working on?
I have always a lot of projects in the same time. So I work for Graphic Identity, La Comédie de Clermont, Le Frac Méca. So I have this very big projects, but I make also projects for Hermès. I make some drawings that are transformed into objects. So I make some research. So it's a sort of, it's a different kind of project because it's a drawing. It's not with graphic design constraints. It's different because it's pure drawing in a way.
Right.
Even if it's letter drawing, it's a fundamental creation, and I think it's a chance for me to work in this kind of projects.
Amazing.
How exciting. Can't wait to see how that transforms.
Yeah.
But thank you for joining us today, Fanette. We really appreciate your time, and it was great speaking to you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure for me.
Thanks for listening to Design Signatures. Since this is Fedrigoni's podcast with a beautiful printed companion publication called Best of Publishing.
It's made up of 3 parts: Read Me, which showcases the work of the talented guests on this podcast; Choose Me, a fan swatch sorted by how the paper is used rather than the product type; and Footnotes, a practical guide to the art of publishing.
We hope this toolkit and podcast inspire you. Want to learn more? Just reach out. Design Signatures is brought to you by Fedrigoni in collaboration with TM.
We'll be sharing more stories about design, creativity, special paper and beyond.
Follow us on Instagram and visit the Fedrigoni Special Papers website for updates.
Thanks for listening and catch you in the next episode.